Well, thank you very much, both of you. Thank you in particular for doing me the honour of inviting me to give this lecture. I've been very sparing in flying anywhere to give lectures, and in fact this is the first time for about 18 months that I have flown anywhere to give a lecture, because I so much believe in the whole purpose of CONVOCO. So thank you very much, Corey. And let me pick up on your theme first, Corey, and then I'll segue into what Clemens said. The equality of opportunity between generations is, in my view, a very fine common purpose for a society. I come from the society, Britain, which has the lowest intergenerational mobility in the whole of the OECD. It is off the map intergenerationally unequal. What Clemens didn't add to that is that Sheffield, my hometown, is now the poorest city in the whole of England. And South Yorkshire, my region, was the heartland of the Brexit vote. And exactly as Clemens said, the Brexit vote you can predict very well in terms of how well a region has done. My home region used to be prosperous and collapsed. When I was a kid, it was a prosperous place, and now it's a desperate place. Opinion polls, I'm an official representative, advisor to the government on regional inequality, and so I get the information on the government opinion polls. So let me share them with you. They're secret. There is only, this is an astounding fact, but they've done research on what purposes do people agree on in Britain? What purposes is there consensus? And Britain is such a polarized society now that there is only one purpose which overwhelmingly everybody agrees on. They agree regardless of their political party, regardless of whether they voted Brexit or Remain, you name it, regardless of class, regardless of income. What is that purpose? It's that it is outrageous that there is such a massive difference between the opportunities of children born to working class parents in poor parts of the country and upper middle class parents brought up in rich parts of the country. And so leveling up these massive intergenerational inequalities is the only common purpose that Britain can find. Yeah? The other opinion poll result, which the government certainly won't want me to share, so I won't, is that there's a massive consensus that the government won't be able to achieve what it set out to do, a view with which I have some sympathy. This lecture tonight is going to be in three parts, really. I'm going to first look at communities and polities, then at the process of transition. How do we change from a disastrous society like Britain to one where we actually are united around this common purpose, in Britain, intergenerational mobility, and other societies, you can have other common purposes, but try and bring people together. What's that process that brings people together? And then finally, I want to pivot to Germany now, because I think Germany really is at a pivotal moment. And so I'll end with that. But let me start with communities and polities. Communities, to understand communities, you need to understand a little bit about the latest research on evolutionary biology. And the world leader on this is a guy called Joe Heinrich, who's head of the Department of Evolutionary Biology at Harvard, and he's come out with very, very important research. So the essential argument is that he's got two very thick books. So I'm going to do a little violence in summarizing it in a few sentences. But humans have evolved to be neither saints, which is not we're a mammal, right? And mammals have evolved to be less than saints, unfortunately. Right? Most mammals are greedy, selfish, and lazy. The Darwinian process, nature red in tooth and claw. But, although we're a mammal, we are a very unusual mammal. We're utterly unlike other mammals. We've evolved over the last 200,000 years to be remarkably pro-social, for a start. We work in groups, and there's a very good reason for that. When we came down from the trees onto the savannah, the African savannah, my God, it was scary. Right? Unlike other animals, we didn't have fur or armor plating or scales or anything. We didn't have great big claws. Right? We were trying to stand upright, but we weren't very good at it because we were designed to be on all fours. We stood upright to try and see above the grass, but we weren't very fast. And we were facing mammoths, we were facing lions. This was a desperately scary environment. And so the only way we could survive once we came down from the savannah, down from the trees, was to cooperate in big groups. And the groups in which we have evolved to cooperate, groups about 150, something known as the Dunbar Constant. And in those groups, we learnt mutuality. We learnt to work together to cooperate for common purposes. We learnt to trust each other. About 150 turns out to be the maximum size that you can know everybody. And so gossip in a community can gradually mean you can build a reputation for being reliable or a reputation for being unreliable. And with that incentive, you build a reputation for being trustworthy because it's such an asset. So that's the evolutionary process which produced us as very, very unusually pro-social. And that's a huge strength of communities. Communities that sort of size that trust each other, work for the common purpose of the group. In addition to that, we turned out to be remarkably imaginative and creative. And so that's another feature in which we're a completely unique mammal. Huh? I like to compare us with squirrels. Right? In fact, I sit and write my books under the trees and I watch the squirrels running up and down and jumping. Squirrels are awfully clever. Squirrels can do something that if I could get my 3 teenagers to do it, I'd feel triumphant. Squirrels think ahead and save nuts for when it's cold and there's no food. If I could get my kids to think a day ahead, it would be an improvement, right? So squirrels are really awfully smart, right? They're very good at jumping and all sorts of things. They're very clever. Huh? But what squirrels don't seem to have done at any stage is imagine, is there an even better way of life than being a squirrel? Huh? If you want to understand what a squirrel was like 100,000 years ago, just look at one today. Right? They're genetically the same, and their behavior's the same. Right? Try that with humans. Right? We're genetically identical to the people kicking around 100,000 years ago, right? But if you want to understand the behavior of people 100,000 years ago, it's completely useless looking at people today. Right? How have we got from where we were 100,000 years ago, terrified that we were going to be gored by a mammal or chased by a lion? Right? Somehow we managed to come with common purpose, get rid of the mammoths, right? I wouldn't, I'm glad I wasn't. I'm glad they did it. But anyway, we're clearly imaginative and creative, and that has driven us to more and more ambitious purposes, more and more ambitious goals. And that's human beings. We're goal-directed, but we're imaginative. We can imagine things that are better than the situation we're in. Right? And then we think, how can we do it? How can we actually make things better? Now, our tragedy is that it's much easier to imagine things that are better than to achieve them. Yeah? What did we want? There's a famous line, what we wanted was flying cars, and what we got is 84-character Twitter. Right? Now, probably our grandchildren will have flying cars, by which time they'll want something very much better. Right? So that's the process of sort of a restless imagining of life as better, and then the struggle to achieve it. Right? That's the unique feature of the human condition. And it plunges us into a state known as radical uncertainty, which is that we're always trying to achieve goals that we don't know how to achieve. Right? And that's a very, very important feature of humanity. We're trying to do things we don't know how to do. We now live in modernity in big organizations, communities of work and communities of place. That's our lived experience. Corinne did a brilliant job tonight. You've just come from your community of work and the lived experience of doing your job, and Corinne dragged you out of that into a world of ideas. Right? That was what she just said, that's what I'm going to do in my 15 minutes, and she did it. Right? That's our lived experience in communities of work and communities of place. And modernity is a world not just of communities, it's a world of polities, political entities, states. And let me say a little bit about those. Because polities have a very, very different dynamic from communities. Communities, they grow up to 150. They can't grow much beyond that because we can't know everybody, we can't trust everybody beyond that, right? No matter what Facebook tells us. My teenagers sometimes say, I've got 2,300 friends on Facebook. They haven't, right? Or at least they've got 2,300, which include bots coming out of Russia and all sorts of things, but not friends. So polities are driven by, unfortunately, the history of polities, the emergence of polities, is scale economies and violence. They are militarized hierarchies in which a leader used his military power to build a polity. And some leaders have tried to build enormous polities, right? empires. Right? Mercifully, nobody has yet managed to build a world empire. Mercifully, because it would clearly be absolutely awful. It would be so detached from ordinary people's concerns and reality. But you know, starting with Genghis Khan, several people have had a good try at creating these vast empires. Actually, before Genghis Khan, you got Alexander the Great, same sort of drive. The one thing that polities are really good for, that communities can't do, is scale. They can be big. And unfortunately, as any economist will tell you, scale is very useful. Scale is fundamental to the escape from mass poverty. I spent much of my life working on the tail of the elephant, the bottom billion, who on the latest data are actually not just falling behind, they're falling apart, thanks to COVID and so on. But I see in those societies a pitiful mass poverty because they've not managed to harness scale. Small, in economic terms, is not beautiful. Small is doomed to poverty. That is the reality. And so the good feature of a polity is scale. Another good feature potentially is you've got hierarchy with a leader on top. And I'm going to argue that that can be a very, very good thing. So polities produce hierarchies with a leader on top, and they produce scale. Communities produce mutuality and the willingness to come together and trust. Right? Clearly, what we need is the best features of community and the best features of polity. And so I'm shortly going to tell you how that can be done. It's manifestly very difficult. If you look around the world, where almost everywhere in the world has polities, and it has communities, but they've not managed to fuse. A lot of the places I work on have fused the worst features of a polity with the worst features of a community. They're still doomed to mass poverty because they can't do economies of scale in production. They've got a lot of little communities that are completely fragmented or oppositional identities, and no leader is trusted enough to pull them together. Yeah? So, how do we get out of that? What is a transition away from a polarized society to one that comes together? And I'll give you 3 principles, and then I'll give you practical examples. So, one principle is the sort of knowledge we need to, and how we need to create knowledge. And that is to say, we need to fuse 2 very different sorts of knowledge. One is the generic knowledge that people like me have. You know, if you want to have an informed strategy for a society, it's not a bad idea to listen to the specialist academics who have pots of knowledge, right? Whatever you do, don't let them run things, right? Because they are very weak on lived experience. Right? Academics are self-selected from people who really have ducked out of life, to be honest. Right? You want to draw on that sort of generic knowledge, but who should you give agency to? It has to be people with contextual knowledge, lived experience of this place now. I've been working with my home region of Sheffield and South Yorkshire in actually a remarkable process of people coming together around a new common purpose, which is whatever else we want to do, we want South Yorkshire to be a more prosperous place for our kids. There's a common purpose which people have rapidly and remarkably come together around. But it's vital that they have the agency, not people in Whitehall. That's why people are completely right. Whitehall is not going to be able to save Sheffield. It doesn't know anything about it. Right? And so the agency has to be more localized in society. Germany scores very high on that. You have a much more devolved society. Britain is the most centralized society in Europe, even more centralized than France, off the map more centralized. So, fusion and agency, that's right. You fuse the generic knowledge with the contextual knowledge. Fortunately, generic knowledge is dead easy to share. That's my job. It's the job of every professor to write in a way that ordinary people can understand quickly. I set the goal of my books can be read on a beach, because when I first thought about writing The Bottom Billion, I was on a beach, and I thought, gosh, this is the time when most people have some time to read a book. And they don't want to read a textbook whilst they're on a beach, on holiday. They want to read something that's readable. My goodness, it's difficult. As Clement said, writing a book that can be read on a beach but actually has some intellectual content is very hard to write. Right? So, fusion and agency. Second, subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the principle that who should have the agency for achieving a goal? And the answer is you go to the lowest level at which that goal is feasible to be achieved. Now, some goals, global warming can only be achieved with some global cooperation. Right? Peace in Europe, as President Macron's just realized, has to be achieved by the whole of Europe coming together. Never mind whether it voted for Brexit or not, right? The whole of Europe's got to come together, right? Some goals can be achieved at the level of the city. I got to know Olaf Scholz when he was mayor of Hamburg, because he'd read my work and he wanted to talk about it. And so Germany, in Olaf Scholz's DNA, is this local community, because Hamburg is unusual, even by German standards, in having a lot of devolved power. And the final principle is fusion, subsidiarity, rapid learning. Remember, we're in this existential problem that we're trying to achieve goals we don't know how to achieve. What should you do? Well, learn rapidly. You learn from others, and you learn from experiment. Experiment, you try different things, and you track to see what is working. Right? Britain should have known that COVID was coming. After all, it had already happened in Italy. Not only did it not travel, news of it didn't travel adequately from Asia to Britain, it didn't even travel from Italy to Britain. That's because the British civil service has a belief that it is the finest civil service in the world, and so doesn't need to look at anything else. If it looks anywhere, it looks at America and congratulates itself on looking better. Right? Now, actually, Clemens put up the Gatsby curve, and if I could just remind you what was on it, Britain was the highest level of intergenerational social inequality on that graph, right? except for Peru, which is off there. In fact, looking at that graph, I realized I can predict the countries where the sales of the future of capitalism are highest by getting up to the top right-hand corner of that graph. It's a perfect predictor of sales of the future of capitalism, because these societies are polarized in both dimensions. Right? And Peru, well, I just invited to go back to Peru today to speak. They've had a choice between a crook and an idiot. Neither should have been anywhere near a presidential election. Right? So Britain's right up there on that Gatsby curve. Did you notice what was right at the bottom, in this corner here? It was Denmark. Denmark. The lowest degree of intergenerational inequality in the whole of the modern world. And the difference between Denmark and Britain is staggering. Right? How do we make that transition? How do we get from Britain to Denmark? How do we get out of the polarization of America? There are bottom-up processes and there are top-down processes. The great student of the bottom-up processes is Robert Putnam, the greatest sociologist, political sociologist in the world, a top professor at Harvard. He's got a magnum opus which he just came out with very late in life called The Upswing, and I very much recommend it. The Upswing plus Michael Sandel's The Tyranny of Merit is those two you get a lot from. So, what are the bottom-up processes? They work in both directions. Just before I tell the happy story of bringing kindnesses together, let me tell the story of bottom-up processes which build hatreds. There we need to look no further than social media. Social media at the moment has produced teenagers obsessing about their curated selves. Teenage girls in particular are terrified that their curated selves are not sufficiently attractive. And so the suicide rate amongst teenagers and the depression rates and the mental ill health amongst teenagers has rocketed. Right? This is a tragedy that's entirely avoidable. Right? But it gets worse. As a father of three teenagers, I worry about that bit every day. But I'm also working in Ethiopia, which was a dirt poor society which for 20 years grew very fast, great success of reducing poverty, coming together around an objective, and then it fell into civil war. And what helped to ignite that civil war was Facebook. Facebook has algorithms designed by the most brilliant people in the world. And what are those algorithms designed to do? Keep people on the page. Because what is Facebook's revenue source? Ads. And so the brilliant minds in the world have solved the problem of how to keep people on watching Facebook, right? That's what the most brilliant minds in the world have been diverted to by, of course, money. Right? What do we know about these algorithms? We know it all from a very senior official in Facebook who had the decency to blow the whistle. And she testified recently under oath in the British Parliament. And I hope, Haugen is her name, and I hope you follow it up. Because what she testified was that, and she said, as I saw this happening, I knew it was going to end in terrible things, because the algorithms were feeding people's extreme views. And around America, there were a lot of people who'd left Ethiopia from different ethnic groups. The Oromo, the Amhara, the Tigrayans, the this, the that, right? And these groups wanted to massage grievance against other groups living in their region. And so, even before Ethiopia got into civil war, it got into appalling violence within each region, as the majority ethnic group incited from America advocated ethnic cleansing within the region. 3 million people were displaced within Ethiopia by the violence of ethnic cleansing, region by region. And that was driven by Facebook algorithms. And we let it happen. They let it happen. I mean, the devastating evidence was that they knew this was happening, but it was profitable. That's what we've sunk to. And I'm very pleased that the European Commission has now started to face down Facebook, right? So that's a bottom-up process of hatreds. Now bottom-up processes of kindness. And Robert Putnam's wonderful book, The Upswing, starts with the story of the formation of the Rotary Club. The Rotary Club, founded by one lonely guy who'd come from small-town America where there was community, and he found himself in Chicago. He'd got a good job, doing well, but he was lonely because he'd seen community in action in Iowa, small-town Iowa, and in Chicago, he didn't see community. He saw a lot of successful people like himself, individualists, and he was lonely. And so he just put an advert in the paper saying, I'm lonely, I'm successful, can we come together, other people like me? 200 people showed up for the first meeting. All he did was a place and a time. And then when they came together, he said, here's the rules of this society. We're not going to discuss business deals. We're all successful business people. You're not going to talk business. You're going to talk community in Chicago. You're going to think, what about the people unlike us who are at the bottom in Chicago? What could we do to help them? And that became the rule for the Rotary Club in Chicago. After about 10 years, it was so successful that other towns in America started to copy it. And so it was 10 years after it had been founded, it was able to hold its first convention. Then it went international. Now it's millions of people. But the rules have stayed the same. Right? So, and again, what does the Rotary Club do? They're not saints. Saints sets the bar too high for most of us. But they are much better than the greedy, lazy, selfish individualists who we're told by economics is what we are. And let me give you one other example of kindness, which is nearer to home, and that is, because my grandfather left a little village near Stuttgart, I'm often invited back to Stuttgart to speak, and I'm hugely impressed by the business community in Stuttgart, and I'm sure it's the same here, where the business community in Stuttgart has come together for the community in big ways. And one of the ways it's done it is by establishing a norm which says we've got to train the next generation of young people in Stuttgart. Not just the clever guys who are going to go and become lawyers, but the people who are just going to want a job, a skilled job, and we will do the vocational training. What struck me both in Germany and in Switzerland was that firms didn't brag how many people we're training, because if they didn't train the next generation, they'd feel ashamed about it. In Britain, training of young people has completely collapsed. The apprentice system was dismantled. This is one of the massive reasons for the lack of social mobility. You either go to university, try and become a lawyer or whatever, or you're done for. Huh? There is no middle ground of skill in Britain left. Trying to rebuild that is enormously difficult, because firms, individual firms say, well, I don't want to do it. It'll cost. And other firms are not doing it, so why should I? Huh? That's the trap to which Britain has fallen in, and it's not the trap you're in. What about the top-down processes? The top-down processes are quite exciting because there are two styles of leadership that are both evolutionarily stable. And again, if we go outside the species of human, we don't find that. Outside the human, there is only one form of leadership which has evolved to be stable, and that is dominance. The alpha male, it usually is a male, right? If you think hard enough, you might be able to come up with some examples of political leaders in modern economies that have alpha male type leadership by dominance. Until recently, one would look across to America and see a leader by dominance. But now we look closer to home and we see Putin. Right? The alpha male, if ever there was one. Right? That's the dominance form of leader, the bragging, the exaggerated self-confidence that I know best. You do what I want. And of course, it's wildly overconfident because, remember radical uncertainty? We're trying to achieve purposes we don't know how to achieve. We need rapid learning. Has Putin got rapid learning? He sure hasn't. He's made the fundamental mistake of every dictator and surrounded himself by sycophants who daren't tell him even the basic military realities. Yeah? And if we want the other type of leadership, it's very different, but it is also evolutionarily stable, only in humans. And we need to look no further than President Zelensky. Yeah? President Zelensky had a very different background from President Putin. President Putin's background was KGB, military intelligence, right? Military hierarchy, all that. Zelensky's background was as a comedian, an entertainer. And so what Zelensky's really good at is communicating. And I distinguish two types of leader: commanders-in-chief and communicators-in-chief. And when Putin invaded the Ukraine, what the Ukraine desperately needed was a communicator-in-chief who could speak to people and say, things have changed, we're going to have to learn rapidly, and we don't know what to do, but here's my suggested strategy. And first, he established trustworthiness by this massive statement of self-sacrifice. I am going to stay in Kiev even though I'm target number one and Putin is heading here. I am going to die in Kiev because I believe in this country. And that dramatic gesture, right, which Putin has not made. 15 of his generals are dead now, but he's still alive, right? So you start from establishing credibility, and then you say, here's my strategy. If we fight against Putin, then, and I talk with other leaders, other countries, we can probably shame other communities into helping us. But only if you show solidarity of purpose, and actually, if you're a male of fighting age, you stay in Ukraine and you fight. What do? I don't know. I'm a comedian, not a fighter. I'm going to devolve agency to the local fighting groups. You join your militia in your town and you work out how best to resist. That's devolved agency. And that strategy began to work. Zelensky was a brilliant communicator. Country after country, brilliant appeals to the people over the heads of their leaders. And that did shame the leaders, and it's produced massive change. So Zelensky is the living example of leaders as communicators in chief. Those are the sorts of leaders we need for the 21st century. People who set common goals, whatever they are, and then bring people together. Right? And just look what Zelensky managed to do. He brought together Ukraine as a common identity. Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers came together to say, we're all Ukrainians. Right? He healed across a language rift. That's quite difficult, but he did it. Right? So, Germany, you're at a pivotal moment. It's a pivotal moment because for a long time, you've not had to distinguish between common interests and common purposes. Your interests, or so your leaders told you for a long time, your interests happen to coincide with your purposes. Right? Your purposes, your interests were to trade, and that was fine because by trading, you'd build peace. Right? And you could just about believe that was true until Putin came on the scene. You can't believe it now. Right? You've got a very stark choice between your interests and your purposes. Your interests are very clearly to maintain trade with Russia, importing the gas, exporting to the market in Russia, which is much bigger than Ukraine. And meanwhile, what's your interest in Ukraine? Get out of it. German firms did a massive and magnificent job of building the economy of Ukraine. There's huge offshoring from Germany's superb firms, plenty of which are here in Munich, where you exported first to Poland and imported products from them, became interdependent with the Polish economy, and then you did the same with the Ukrainian economy. You created thousand upon thousand of jobs in the Ukraine, thanks to the interdependence with German firms. Your interest now is to cut that, because the supply chain from Ukraine may not be reliable. So your interest whether you're running a firm or running the country, is pull back. Don't be dependent on Ukraine. Give them some money, but don't be dependent on Ukraine, and don't upset Russia. So don't supply them any guns. Your purpose is very well stated by Mario Draghi. If the choice is between European democracy and air conditioning, we'll do without the air conditioning, thank you. And that is your choice. That is now your pivotal moment. You have to decide, both as chief executives of firms and as leaders of the country, which do you do? I know Olaf Scholz. I think he's been magnificent in actually changing from an initial position that he inherited, which was basically we don't have to worry about purposes because our purposes are coincident with our interests, to actually telling people that's not true. Right? There's still a long way to go, but you haven't got long to do it. And so there is a moment now when, if Germany chooses right, you will actually achieve what for all my lifetime you've been striving for, which is redemption. You will achieve it the only way that people achieve redemption, and that is by sacrificing your interests for a common purpose. Thank you very much.